Uh, if there are teachers in the audience from the community joining us for the day also, and to the many John Jay and William Patterson students present. I also want to thank from the start the organizing committee, Michael Principe, Juliana Campanelli, and George Andropoulos for making the event possible, and Bob Seal and David Lelyville, who really worked very hard in the last 3 weeks or so to pull this together. I am Isabel Tirado, the Dean of the Humanities and Social Sciences. My colleague, Dean Baronico, cannot be here today because they're having an accrediting visit. So things take priority, immediate priority. The College of Humanities and Social Sciences is very proud to be co-sponsoring the Conference on Globalization with the Human Face. The college has been, as some of you heard last night, in the forefront of the university's efforts to internationalize the curriculum. As President Spears said last night in his opening remarks, the college has launched several new programs, including the Master's in Public Policy and International Affairs, a Latin American Studies program, and a Nation Studies program, all of which are also co-sponsoring this event. The college is also, at this point, very involved in a campus-wide initiative to promote civic engagement. And I believe that the conference integrates both of those efforts, internationalization and civic engagement. The conference began last night, and I see some familiar faces who were there last night, with a keynote address by the Honorable Mary Robinson, who framed the discussion on globalization in ethical terms. As educators, we have a responsibility to foster among our students an awareness of their role as citizens in a global age. The long-term cultural, economic, strategic concerns of the United States can only be served by greater emphasis on global and international themes in the curriculum. Students must be given the opportunity to encounter the issues to be discussed in today's conference early on in their studies. As educators, we also have the obligation to encourage our students to develop proficiencies in foreign languages, in cultural understanding and cross-cultural analysis that will enable them to better understand the world today and help them to prepare for national and international environment that requires those skills. I now turn the floor to Michael Principe, who will continue to introduce our panelists on today's program. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Welcome. How many of you came to the festivities last night? Raise your hand, please. Oh, we had a nice turnout. Oh, good. And you're back for the second day. That's great. We had a lovely evening last night, and we're very much looking forward to today's panel discussions. And we'll get it started right away, as we're starting a bit late. I want to introduce Dr. George Andropoulos, who is an associate professor of government at John Jay College, City University of New York. He's also affiliated with the Graduate Center there, teaching graduate courses. He's an international law scholar, an international human rights scholar, and he is the co-chair of the organizing committee and will be the moderator for the first panel. So I'm going to introduce George, and he'll introduce the panelists for you. George?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. I think, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your kind remarks. I'm George Andropoulos, and I would like to welcome you all to our panel discussion this morning. Before I do that, I would like to express also on behalf of John Jay my words of thanks for the people who helped make this event possible. This event started 2 years ago with a discussion held among Michael Principe, Giuliana Campanelli, Jacques Fomeran, and myself on ways to address the ethical dimensions of the process of globalization. Since then, we've held several meetings and brainstorming sessions, and what you see today here would not have been possible but for the assistance and support of many colleagues, both at John Jay and at William Patterson. In particular, I want to take this opportunity to thank the presidents of our respective institutions, Dr. Gerald Rinch and Dr. Arnold Spert, our respective provosts, Dr. Basil Wilson and Dr. Cherna Sese, Dean Boronico of the Cochaco School of Business, Dean Isabel Tirado, and of course the members of our organizing committee, Mel Edelstein, Martin Weinstein, John Mason, Maya Chada, and Ed Burns. I hope I didn't leave anybody out because I'd be in trouble otherwise. Okay. The topic for this morning is globalization in historical perspective. Anything new and for whom? And one of the reasons that we wanted to address this issue in the first panel is because, as you probably know, there has been a lot of debate to what extent what we today call as globalization is a unique process, or there have been precedents in the past. And if they have been, what have been the similarities and differences between the current phase of the globalization process and previous phases. For example, people like Paul Krugman have argued that in many ways the world was economically, according to some key indicator, much more integrated at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century than it is today. Some other people have argued, while this is true, other issues have come up in the international agenda to make the current phase of globalization both similar to previous, but also in many ways unique. And some of the unique features of the globalization process, this current globalization process, were highlighted by our keynote speaker yesterday, the Honorable Mary Robinson, who reminded us in her thoughtful remarks that, for example, the current phase of globalization is unfolding within a normative framework which generates expectations among the key actors involved of certain type of behavior and concomitant expectations of accountability among a growing universe of stakeholders in the process of globalization. So in a nutshell, what is unique and what is different about this process of globalization? And if indeed we are talking about a unique normative framework which did not exist in previous eras of globalization, what are the parameters of this normative framework? Who are the key actors involved? Who are the stakeholders? And what are the expectations of accountability as to their conduct? So to address these and related issues, we have a distinguished group of panelists, and I'm very pleased that they could be with us this morning, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. To my immediate left, I should remind you that these are geographical and not ideological designations, because we don't know what they are going to say, is Joaquin Almunia, who has been a member of the Spanish Parliament since the late 1970s. He is a member of the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party and has served as Minister for Labor and Social Security, as well as Minister for Public Administration. In addition, he was his party's Secretary General in the late 1990s. Mr. Almunia has earned a degree in Law and Economics from the University of Deusto. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. Thank you. And went on to teach labor law and social security at the University of Alcalá de Henares before being elected to Parliament. On my distant left is Beth Stevens.
I like to call it the far left.
The far left. Okay, the far left. Okay. The far left is Beth Stevens, a good friend and colleague from Rutgers University Law School. She graduated from Harvard, and then she went on to do her JD at the University of California at Berkeley. Beth is an expert in international human rights law. Her co-authored book, International Human Rights Litigation, is one of the nation's leading sources on the subject. Before joining the academic community, he worked for several years for the Center for Constitutional Human Rights, and she has litigated cases addressing human rights violations in Bosnia, Guatemala, Haiti, East Timor, and Ethiopia. And she continues actually to work for the Center for Constitutional Rights, and at the moment he's working on cases filed against US-based corporations doing business overseas. To my immediate right is Professor Richard Franke, who is a professor of anthropology at Montclair State University. In addition to doing extensive research in Sahel Africa, Indonesia, East Timor, and South Asia, and publishing extensively, of course, on his findings, he has recently co-authored 2 highly respected books on local democracy and development in Kerala, India. One of them is entitled Democracy at Work in an Indian Industrial Cooperative, the story of Kerala Bnesh Bidi, is that okay? And Local Democracy and Development, the People's Campaign for Decentralized Planning in Kerala. And finally, to my extreme left, the extreme right, sorry, God, I'm getting confused here. They converge in the end, is my colleague from the City University of New York, Immanuel Ness, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. He has written extensively on low-wage minority and immigrant communities issues, on labor electoral issues, and on social movements. He had just completed a book on parallel unions, which focuses on immigrant organizing. I have asked each one of our panelists to speak for about 15 minutes, and if they exceed that time, then the human rights response will not be very sensitive to their dignity, I told them. So they have about 15 minutes to give us their views on that, and then we're going to open the floor for discussion. So we will start with Joaquin Almunia.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers of this conference, and I thank you very much to have invited me to participate from this moderate place of the table. Center left, as we call it in Europe. So, about globalization, what can I say to you about that? First of all, I think, a few years ago, some people discussed about the reality of globalization. Now I think nobody can deny that globalization is growing faster than ever. It's not the first time that the world is globalizing. Maybe the first time was during the Roman Empire, or maybe before the Roman Empire. Of course, Spanish people had to do something about globalization 500 years ago when we participate with other people to come here to America for the first time, for the known first time in history, to merge these two worlds in only one world. At the end of the 19th century, of course, the economy of the most advanced countries of the time, with the industrialization, were globalizing many aspects of the world economy. But now I think during the last 20 years, 25 years, globalization is growing faster than ever, driven by new technologies, the new technologies of communication. It's very important that the role of these new technologies in the way we feel that we are living in the same world at the same time, with the same information, with the same possibilities to go through internet to everywhere and to discover that other people in the other part of the world are doing at the same time. And of course, trade and exchanges are a very important thing But we are not only globalizing the economy or the exchange of information. I think we feel that we are living every day more and more in the same world with the same problems as the problems of the other people on the other side of the world are our problems, and we have to participate in finding some solutions for these problems, or by suffering the consequences or not of not finding these solutions to the problems. I think that this process of interdependence, because the same concept of globalization means interdependence of one to each other, I think won't stop. I think this is a process that will define the world that we will live and our sons will live in the future during this century. But this is not a process that is growing everywhere at the same speed. The economy is going fast in the globalizing trends. Politics is going very slow. It worries me very much because we can't wait for the solutions coming from the markets to solve many of our problems. The markets are able to solve some problems, but not all the problems, and we need politics, institutions, decisions taken by the people who represent the citizens to discuss and to solve many of our big and most important problems. And the politics is not globalizing at the same speed, at the same pace than economy. And in the moment when we feel that we belong to the same world, we are discovering that many people in this world have different values and have different feelings about the same things. So the globalization creates a more interdependent world, a more deeper knowledge of what is happening in the world, but we are taking notice that many people in the world is not feeling the same things than we feel, and maybe have different values as we have. So we have to tackle new problems in this moment. It's a new reality, but we have not a new legality, we have not a new juridical order, we have not a new political order to organize in a rational way this new reality that we have today. So there is a lack of a political answer to globalization. To what problems, or to what, if you want to say that, to what threats we have to find solutions from the political point of view? Of course, there are some problems that we knew before we started to talk about globalization. Poverty in the world, of course, it existed before the late 80s or the late 90s of the last century. But we now know very well which are the main figures of this big problem of poverty. In this era of global information, that we know everything that's happening today in the world, we know that there are more than 1,000 million adults who cannot read, illiterate. There are in this world today 200 million children without school, and in this world there are 100 million of children who has not completed the primary schools, the primary level of studies in the school. In the south of our world, in the south of the planet, there are 60% of the world students, but only 12% of the world budget for education. So there are some figures of the world with big problems of poverty, and this world has enormous problems coming from the demographic point of view. That is the first time, I think, that we are worried by the increasing of the population. In the 19th century, Malthus was a pessimistic economist and philosopher that thought that the amount of production of food was not able to fulfill the needs of the people, of the population of the world. Now we have the technical resources to increase the production of food, but we are not able to realize how we can live in the same world with the same resources with not 6,000 million people as we have today, but maybe 9,000 million people as we will have in 50 years. In only 50 years, we will increase in 50% the population of the world. And we don't know if we can organize the world, this global world, with these big increases of the population. At the same time that in some of the most advanced countries, as the European ones, as my own country, Spain or France or Germany or many other countries in Europe, we have a demographic problem not because of the increasing of the population, not because of the growth of the population, but because of the lack of the young people in our population structures. So in the same time that the population of the world will increase in 50%, maybe if we don't find any solution, and I hope we will find, but we can live in a society where 30 or 40% of the people is more than 65 years old or 75 or 70 years old. We have demographic problems, we have environmental problems. We are not having a growth model which is sustainable. We are not able to sustain this model of growth in this world with 9,000 million people. And of course, we have to tackle new threats in this global world. We are living during the last years with these new threats, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, failing and rogue states, etc., etc. But I don't think that these last issues are the only problems that we will have to tackle in the next, in the coming years. There are these ones, there are new threats, but we have a very deep old threats that we also have to tackle. And I am convinced that these old threats are sometimes the origins of the people who are participating in organizing terrorist networks and the fabrication of weapons of mass destruction, etc. So, which are the consequences of this panorama? In these days, I think we are facing a global world, but the more global is the world, the more local are some of the feelings of the people who live in this world. I think we are tackling in some areas of the world a great search for identity, not for world citizenship, but for a local identity. We are seeing some fundamentalism, we are seeing some intolerance against the difference, we are seeing some raising of nationalism. So this is an apparent paradox, but this is a reality. The more global is the world, the more fundamentalism exists in some areas of the world. Second paradox, the more global is the world, the more protectionism starts to rise in some areas of the world, in the richest countries. Last September, We have seen how in Cancun, Mexico, the richest countries, both the United States and the European Union countries, were not able to offer a fair agreement to the south of the world to find an equilibrium in the developing of exchanges, of the trade and services exchanges. And in a global world, it's impossible to find solutions where the richest countries are the most protectionist one. The richest countries, we have to develop our interest, not only solidarity, our interest telling the other part of the world, the biggest countries of the South, Brazil, Mexico, China, India, many other countries, you can develop your economies with our help because in our interest is your development. And we have to find this kind of economical order. And in this global world is, 1 minute. 1, 2? Thank you. In this global world, generous, the moderator. In this global world, I think it's impossible, and this is a discussion in this country, I think it's impossible to think that one single country, even it is very powerful as it is, this country, can organize the world with an unilateralism that I can't believe that this can be the solution. European Union have to help, but US and European Union, Europe and the United States have to organize themselves for defining a world where other countries can participate at the same level. In the next 50 years, this increase of the population will not take place in the north, will take place in the south. And the economy, not only the population, but the economy of China, Brazil, of India, will become greater and greater. During this century, the economy of China will become one day greater than the economy of the United States. So how can we imagine the world without the participation at the United Nations level, World Trade Union, World Trade Organization level, and other places of these emergent countries who has to collaborate with us to organize the political answers to this world. And this was my point this morning. I think I am in time.
Yes.
I have been moderate, as is my place in the table, and I will ask answers after. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joaquin. And now for an extreme left perspective, we go to Beth. Okay.
See if I can live up to my self-billing. I set an extreme standard for myself. Talking about human rights and globalization with a historical perspective, it for me is very much a question of glass half full, glass half empty, pessimism and optimism really warring in how to look at what's gone on in the world in the last 10 or 20 or 50 years. And in preparing for this talk, I pulled out notes from a talk I gave at a conference at Rutgers where I teach last spring on globalization and my work for human rights accountability. And it was right before the war started in Iraq. And I'm struck by how much more pessimistic I am, how much less full the glass seems now just 6 months later. But let me launch into what I plan to say and come back to that. For human rights, the impact of globalization has an impact on really the two major pieces of my human rights work: the development of human rights standards and the enforcement of those standards. We like to say, or I've often written, that the world has made tremendous progress in the last 50 years in developing human rights standards since World War II. I guess I should be saying last 60 years now, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a whole list of UN-sponsored and regional human rights treaties, agreements, defining the rights to which individual human beings are entitled. In fact, that movement goes back much farther. I suppose perhaps the first globalizers of human rights were the different religions that took over vast parts of the world, and they had a problem that still plagues us today in the definition of human rights, of the division of the world into us and them, so that the religious insiders conquering the heathens and generally valuing the heathens or the other as lesser human beings and entitled to lesser rights. But one of the first truly global human rights movements was the anti-slavery movement, which was an effort to overcome that us and them, and to recognize that other people, the other, did have rights, the right to freedom and to full human rights. And a movement that was remarkably successful during the 19th century, reached success faster in some parts of the world than in others. But and then after World War II, with the start of the United Nations, there was a remarkable effort to draft human rights standards. But it's a movement that has been properly criticized as not including the entire world, as being largely a set of standards developed by the North, by the Europeans and the North Americans, and announced as a universal declaration of human rights and imposed on those countries who gained independence after in the decolonization period and had not participated at all in the drafting of those norms. So the first impact of globalization on the development of human rights is the quite remarkable and I think for the first time in history fact that people from all over the world are actually participating in the debate and the discussion and the development of norms. In the General Assembly of the United Nations, there's a truly remarkable representation of people from all parts of the world. And one of the main impacts of globalization, which I think we all experience in our daily lives, is the increased communication, so that we now can share ideas and information with each other. We know, and we have access to information about what people are thinking in other parts of the world. And all of that can be factored into our discussions and our development of shared values and shared standards for what is acceptable behavior and what are the rights that each of us are entitled to. People in the international human rights field now talk about the almost instantaneous development of new norms, that whereas developments that took decades in the past can now happen within a course of perhaps not a matter of hours, but over the course of weeks and months, or even just years would be relatively short because of the increased communication. One of the campaigns that I worked on in the 90s was the recognition of violence against women as an international human rights violation. And it's certainly an issue that people had been working on for decades, for centuries. But over the course of a relatively short period of time in the early 90s, violence against women was recognized as an issue of international human rights concern. International documents, agreements were developed that recognized that governments have a responsibility for preventing and redressing violence against women, even in the home. And in some of the international criminal tribunals, where there was a concern at the time that they were first developed, first formed, that rape, for example, would not be considered an international human rights violation, and a very well-coordinated international women's movement ensured that that was not true, and that the violence against women in Bosnia in particular was adequately addressed in the International Criminal Tribunal, and then again in the Tribunal for Rwanda. So that there is a movement, a change, and that I think one has to be optimistic about, the ability of people around the world to communicate, to coordinate, to exchange ideas, to come to internationally accepted norms that truly do have the input of people from around the world. I also work on, more directly, on ways to hold people accountable for violations of human rights. And again, the sort of standard line looking back over the past 50 or 60 years is that we've had much more success in developing the norms and much less success in figuring out how to enforce them. So that the same people who are participating in meetings and developing rules don't abide by them in their home countries, and often in their home countries are even suppressing the voices of people who would like to participate in these discussions as well. But the goals of accountability are that all actors, private individuals, government officials, governments themselves, multinational corporations, even our own United States government, should be held accountable for gross human rights abuses, that perpetrators should be punished, and that victims of human rights abuses should get compensation for what they've suffered. And that the compensation for many people includes a public telling of what they've suffered, as well as help in putting their lives back together. And the long-term goal of accountability would be make a world in which human rights violations are the exception rather than the rule, in part because perpetrators know that they will be punished, and in part because rules become so ingrained in a society that violations are less common. And globalization helps globalization in the sense of greater communication, integration, coordination, helps in the drive for accountability. There's been a tremendous increase in networking in the last 10 years, so that, again, it's sharing ideas, it's also sharing information about where people go, where groups of survivors of human rights abuses have gathered, and where perpetrators have gone to escape accountability. So that in my work, one of the things that I work on is suing individuals and corporations who have been responsible for human rights abuses. And we've been able at times to get the word that somebody is coming to the United States, and increasingly by email from different parts of the world, and be able to communicate through these international networks to find the people who have legal claims against the individuals who are traveling, and often to file lawsuits here in the United States against those people as they travel through. In terms of suing corporations, the fact that it is possible now to communicate by email with people in refugee camps in Southeast Asia and inform them of the possibilities of lawsuits, gather their stories, and put them together into a legal case with lawyers working on 3 different continents, has made accountability has given a very important practical boost to the efforts to hold towards accountability. And of course, those who are committing abuses have often had greater access to these kinds of communications, so that we're evening the scales in some ways with our grassroots networks that have a greater ability to compete with the multinational networks that have long been in place. So some of the very well-known efforts at accountability in the past decade have been very much a product of these kinds of networks. The arrest of the former Chilean General Pinochet in England, based on an arrest warrant from Spain and on information from Chile, from Argentina, which really galvanized the international movement to seek ways to hold accountable those who had committed abuses in the past. Pinochet eventually was allowed to go back to Chile, but the international uproar that surrounded his arrest led to a tremendous change in attitudes in Chile towards the possibility of accountability, and has had a major impact on that country. One of the groups that I work with has just finished a successful trial of a Chilean general living in Florida, who's been living in Florida for many years, who was sued for his involvement in some murders of political prisoners in the weeks right after the coup in Chile. And again, the case was put together through a network of lawyers in Florida and California and Chile that might have been possible 10 or 20 years ago, but certainly would have been much more difficult, and reflects to a large extent the ability to communicate and ways in which our world has gotten smaller. Two more minutes to talk about the United States. In this historical movement, our own government has played, I strongly believe, a very mixed role, and I would say a very hypocritical role. We've worked very hard, very strongly for the development of standards, but we've been very spotty in our enforcement of those standards. We push vigorously for the punishment of those our government considers undesirable. We ignore perpetrators in parts of the world that we think are of lesser importance or of strategic importance to us. I heard a report yesterday about the trade-offs in President Bush's support for Premier Putin in Russia, which has been, in return for support on Iraq, has been not being uncritical of human rights violations, crackdowns on the press and political opponents there. We also fight fiercely to stop any tribunal that might hold U.S. officials or private citizens or even U.S. corporations accountable under international law. We've been putting tremendous pressure on countries around the world to agree not to send any U.S. citizens to the new International Criminal Court, a court which is empowered to hear only the very worst human rights abuses. So crimes against humanity, genocide, torture, which are not prosecuted properly in the United States, are the only kinds of cases that could be brought to the International Criminal Court, but our government adamantly, and I would go so far as to say hysterically, opposes the possibility that any of our citizens might be sent there. There's actually a law passed in Congress which authorizes the U.S. military to rescue any U.S. citizen being held before the International Criminal Court, which would require an invasion of the Netherlands, where the prisoners are going to be held. We lobbied Belgium to change their universal jurisdiction law. We've refused to abide by an Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and now the International Red Cross statements that the detainees on Guantanamo being held post 9/11 and post-Afghanistan are entitled to some process. They're being held with absolutely no rights, no ability to challenge in any way or even to inquire, to be told why they're being held. I mean, and at the same time, we're saying that Iraqi war criminals must be brought to justice. Historically, and this what I call hypocrisy goes back for decades. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld last spring said that Saddam Hussein has taken his place with Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, and Nicolae Ceausescu in the pantheon of failed, brutal dictators. But he left out of the list the failed, cruel dictators who were allies of the United States and often put in power by the United States. I lived for many years in the 80s in Nicaragua, where the people of Nicaragua had just overthrown Somoza, a dictator put into place and kept in place by U.S. support, about whom President Roosevelt, our own FDR, once said, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So we play a very mixed role, and my optimistic side would say that this can continue. I put this out as a hope. I'm not sure how firmly I believe this, but that the movement for accountability is growing in the world and will strengthen with globalization. And with the spread of information, creative ideas, new mechanisms, new ways of organizing and working together, it will become increasingly difficult for any nation, including our own, to avoid the demands for even-handed justice. So my hope would be that our country and our leadership, but our people who do get to usually elect our leadership, will recognize that the strength of the accountability movement is not just an unfortunate byproduct of globalization, but one of its more valuable accomplishments.
Okay. Thank you, Beth. Our next speaker is Richard. Franke.
Is there someone up in front who could come up and help me pass these out?
Thank you.
Globalization could mean a number of very positive and hopeful things. But the main empirical, on-the-ground reality of globalization that we are experiencing now, I think can better be described as corporate-dominated globalization, in which most of the processes benefit the owners of the largest corporations in the world, and usually this turns out to be to the detriment of ordinary people, especially those in the area called the Third World or the South. Moral outrage at some of the injustices has led to a number of large-scale social movements, which have kind of culminated in the last few years in meetings in Porto Alegre, Brazil, another one to be held this January in Mumbai, India, around the theme, "Another world is possible." The other world that is possible has not yet been defined, and I think that we need to consider three major elements in what might make up that world. First of all, we need to document and detail the injustices that are occurring. Secondly, we need to have a vision, a general vision of what another world might look like. And I'm not going to talk about either of those two today because other people are far more qualified to do it than I am. But a third element of this other world is a set of experiments to create a sort of body of practical ideas about what kinds of undertakings are actually possible in the world that we live in today. In Coulomb, a state assembly district on the southern coast of central Kerala, an attempt is being made to generate an alternative structure to corporate-dominated globalization. The alternative is mainly composed of local democratic managed cooperatives. And this, of course, is a fine idea in theory, perhaps, but now comes the really important second part of the sentence. Local democratically managed cooperatives that can sustain themselves in the current global marketplace. I call this undertaking the Coulomb experiment. It is an experiment that involves approximately 272,000 people, so it is not a micro project, some of which are easier to pull off than larger projects. And it is a district with a long history of political activism, of democratically managed unions and cooperatives that already exist. The word Coulomb comes from two local words. Coulomb is a word for pond, Most Hindu temples in India have a pond associated with them, which is used for religious ceremonies and also for practical things such as bathing and washing animals and so forth. The Marar part is one of the names for Shiva, one of the deities in the Hindu pantheon. Now, the main element of the Marari Coulomb experiment, the main technical element, is something that's fairly well known and kind of established and even widely acclaimed these days, and that is a device called microcredit. And microcredit simply means very small amounts of money that are available for lending to very poor people, sometimes as little as $5 can make a difference in a poor household's life. But the microcredit that's being used in Marari Coulomb is being used in a more organized way, not just household by household, but it is being collected together in neighborhood groups that have been organized, neighborhood groups of 20 to 40 women, and these groups are the nucleus of the experiment. The neighborhood groups meet every Sunday afternoon for 2 to 4 hours, sometimes a little more. They involve things like dance contests for the children. Sometimes a local singer or poet will perform, and there'll be other kinds of non-instrumental activities that are taking place. But the real heart of these meetings is the discussions of what to do with the slowly accumulating microcredit funds. Because to be a part of one of these neighborhood groups, each woman must contribute a little bit of money every week, maybe 10 rupees, $2.50, or a little bit more. And certain people are elected to manage the money. All the books are kept open, everything is discussed in public, all the decisions are made and ratified at these neighborhood group meetings about how to manage this money. In the first couple of years of the project, the approximately 35,000 women who are participating have raised over 54 million Indian rupees, which is a fairly sizable amount of money, which they can now leverage with local cooperative banks to multiply the total amount of money by 4 or 5 times. Some of this money is being used for medical emergencies, for weddings, funerals, or other kinds of household expenses, which has been one of the traditional uses of microcredit around the world. It helps households through difficult times. The interest rates are lower than from the local private money lenders, and everyone seems to benefit, but not very much happens just because of that. It's only when the money is actually invested in some kind of a productive undertaking that the holders of these microcredit funds can hope to actually advance the situation of the households that are joined together into these neighborhood groups. And to do that, they have to figure out things that they can produce locally with local materials and sell to the local market. And so the beginning part of the Marari Coulomb experiment is a set of small, locally managed cooperatives that grow out of these neighborhood organizations that can manufacture soap, the first thing that they've done. And already over 300 households have started manufacturing soap. Soap is an ideal product to start with because soap is approximately 90% coconut oil, and coconut oil is something they have a great deal of in central Kerala along the coast. There's local coconut trees and processing facilities. So they can make use of local products purchased locally, and they can manufacture soap with almost no machinery. The capital investment is very, very low. You need a pot, a spoon, and a mold, and the chemicals that you're going to use, and a little bit of training. The soap is manufactured with local materials, and it is then sold on, they work and manufacture the soap 5 days a week. They then sell the soap on Saturday by going house to house in their local neighborhoods. You buy your neighbor's produced soap for a number of reasons. First of all, it is equal to or slightly cheaper than the soap manufactured by Hindustan Lever Brothers or any of the big multinationals that also sell soap in the area. Secondly, the soap is of equal quality to the soap that the multinationals produce. And third, you buy it because it's manufactured by your neighbor, and by buying it from your neighbor, you're keeping the money in the local village, which actually benefits everyone. Now, all of this is well understood because another element of the Marathi Coulomb experiment is extensive political and economic education that also goes on in these neighborhood group meetings. Soap by itself cannot sustain a very large economic structure, but with the addition of other products, the Marathi Coulomb experiment is expanding. They're now making school notebooks, school bags, umbrellas, emergency lanterns, and they've begun to set up small computer programming offices. This is an area in which over 90% of the population is literate, and so many of these undertakings are feasible here. Now, one of the difficulties that always exists with local small-scale cooperatives, however wonderful they may sound in theory, democratic, egalitarian, participatory, and so on, is that they have a lot of trouble surviving in a hostile marketplace, or in a highly competitive and difficult marketplace. And the solution to that has been developed by the planners of the Marathi Coulomb experiment is to federate these small cooperatives, hundreds of cooperatives, into one large central cooperative, so that each of the individual cooperatives owns one share in the central cooperative. It's not really a multinational corporation owned by private investors. Only the people who work in the cooperatives are allowed to own a share, and to work in the cooperative, you must purchase one share. Only the cooperatives will be allowed to own the central cooperative, and any cooperative that wants to be part of the central cooperative must purchase at least one share. The local cooperatives will elect the management of the large central cooperative, which will purchase things using economies of scale, and with some of the surplus generated by the initial stages of the project, will be able to hire technical staff as needed, but the technical staff who are hired are subject to the control of the elected worker managers of the cooperative. Now, there are some examples internationally that we've seen. One of the most famous ones in northern Spain, the Mondragon cooperatives, that share some of the characteristics of the Marathi Coulomb experiment in a very different setting and with very different kinds of items being produced, much more high-tech. There are also some cooperatives in Kerala and in other parts of India that have generated models that can be somewhat copied and adapted from. But the Marathi Coulomb experiment envisions some additional elements to just producing and selling things beyond the local communities. And I've listed on the handout that you have some of the regional, national, and international products that they plan and have actually already started to produce. Dried vegetable chips, frozen, ready-to-cook shrimp, mussels, and fish. This is an area very rich in marine products. And this leads to one of the other elements that I want to mention here. One of the biggest problems with globalization is the almost total lack of concern for the environmental consequences of their actions that multinational corporations display, particularly in countries outside of Europe and the United States. The Marathi Coulomb experiment is building environmental protection and environmental regeneration right into the project. So that, for example, in the fish production, the first step is to set up a beach erosion protection project and to clean up the more than 5,000 local ponds so that proper fish production can take place. You don't wait until you've created a crisis and then try to solve it. They're trying to manage things in advance. Another element is to introduce nutrition and health projects right at the beginning of the project, and the neighborhood groups lend themselves very well to this. During some of the group meetings that I attended, one of the physicians from the local primary health center would attend. Now, the physicians do work from 11 to 1 on Sundays, but many of them are willing to go over to the neighborhood group meetings on Sunday afternoon, and it's a very convenient place. You have 40 or 50 people standing around, and it's a very convenient place to do quick blood pressure and other kinds of tests. And so they're beginning to introduce a kind of informal process of identifying people with health problems as at the same time. Another element is to revitalize sacred groves. These are groves of trees and other plants that are in or around temples or sort of sub-temple little shrine sites that are very common in the villages of India and certainly in Kerala. And these are some of the last remaining centers of biodiversity in some parts of Kerala. And one of the activities that has generated a great deal of public interest and participation has been going and doing registers where people come out with, and the college students in the botany departments and animal husbandry departments have come out, and they make lists of the various plants that are there. These are then filed in the local village library. There's usually a ceremony that goes along with it. And then a plan is drawn up for how to manage these resources to protect the biodiversity that's remaining, and also discussions on whether there's any economic products that can result from the identification and use of plants that may have gone unnoticed. Okay. Does the Marari Coulomb experiment have a chance to succeed? I would say that the chances are fairly good in the short run. There's a lot of energy. There's a history of political activism. There's lots of people who are ready to get up and speak at meetings. People have a great sense in Kerala of their political, economic, and social rights. They have overcome most of the history of caste oppression. But many problems remain. And as I noted at the beginning, the neighborhood groups and the cooperatives that are to be set up are to be owned by the women in the households. This was a conscious decision made for a number of reasons. I think I'll just mention a couple of them here because of the time pressure. The most important one is that while women do a lot of work for which they don't receive wages, they mostly in Kerala do not work in the wage-earning sector. Therefore, if you're going to lift households out of poverty, and the men are already working, they may be earning very low wages too, but by creating jobs for the women, it's a more efficient and more rapid way to increase the household income. A second reason that women have been identified is that although Kerala has overcome many forms of injustice and inequality in the past, there has never been a really conscious attempt to generate an active movement for women's equality. Although women may have benefited in many ways from the land reforms, the improved health services, the education services, and so forth. So this is in some ways the last major sort of population group that has never been the subject of an organized, conscious campaign to improve their position in society. Does the Marari Coulomb experiment offer a real alternative to corporate-dominated globalization? I think it offers some elements that are worth considering, although in other places, other kinds of strategies may be required. There are some things we can learn from this experiment. The project is intended to create 22,000 globalization-resistant jobs. The jobs in soap making, school notebooks, and so forth follow the pattern of the ideals of the Indian independence leader Mahatma Gandhi, that India should be as self-sufficient as is possible, and therefore the kernel of the economy that's being created is globalization resistant, because to the extent that people buy these products locally, it really doesn't matter what outside forces do. But the designers of the Marari Coulomb project are fully aware that they have limited power in the national and international stage. And that is why the larger federation has been created to give them a kind of leverage and power through a large company. It will be just like a company, except the difference is that it is owned by the workers, and its primary reason for functioning is to generate income for the local economy, not to make profit for stockholders who may not even live in the area. So it's a company with a difference. I don't know how well the large company is going to succeed. It is just being formed now, but all I can report at this point is that I think this is an idea worth thinking about, and I hope that we will see many other of these indigenous and promising potential experiments around the world that will help create a body of knowledge that will make it possible for people to resist and create alternatives to the kind of globalization that we're seeing today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. With your presentation, we're back to the half-full glass part of the conference, and let's see where we go next. Our next speaker is Ness.
I guess, well, first of all, I'd like to thank George Andriopoulos for inviting me to this conference, and the organizer of the conference, and especially thanks to Sheila Collins, who's guided a lot of my thinking over the years through her work and discussions. My topic is somewhat different than many of the topics on the panel, and it in particular deals with the question of human rights violations, labor rights violations in the United States that have now become increasingly severe on the basis of international criticism and also internal criticism. And so I would like to begin by briefly speaking about, I guess, my position on the global economy, very briefly, and then turn to some of the positions of the AFL-CIO, organized labor in the United States, and the International Labor Organization, which has charged the United States with gross violations of labor rights. Well, to begin with, most of my work is on immigrant labor, and I'm not going to talk about immigrant labor indeed. I'm talking about native-born workers for the most part, people who form the fabric of American society for many years, who are not newcomers and are usually here to stay. Very clearly, the predominant groups of people who are, in my view, super exploited are migrant workers who've become a new phenomenon and whose conditions have deteriorated rapidly in the last 2 years. So my take in a nutshell is that a way to look at globalization is to say that the period between the 1930s and the 1940s, where the period was an unusual era in which there was labor peace, where in fact employers engaged faithfully in accepting worker rights to organize, in collective bargaining, and so forth. And this has dramatically changed in the era since the 1970s up till now. And perhaps we can go back to the period before the 1930s and see that as perhaps the real form of capital accumulation, where there is a constant form of industrial restructuring that we now see in the post-New Deal era, perhaps we can call it that. And in that sense, we can say that the 40s through 70s were the exception to the rule. So many of us go back and say, well, we need our rights back. Well, perhaps that may be too late. And I'm not necessarily pessimistic, and I won't quote anybody in that respect, but I think that these are very important points. I'm going to try to go as quickly as possible, so I'm going to skip some of my speech. So it's my view that many people would like to look. In fact, there's a student movement out there. There's the growth of NGOs throughout the United States who are referring to the emergence of sweatshops abroad and some here in this country. That's really great. I am one of those people. And I think it is critical that we examine the abuses of countries abroad of worker rights and the abuses of women and children and slave labor and so forth and so on. What I'm going to do now is to skip and focus on the relationship between a number of forces. And those forces could be two. The international labor bodies, in particular the International Labor Organization, which is an arm of the UN, and the other is organized labor in the United States, as can be seen in the AFL-CIO. And I'd like to point out that these two groups are not necessarily in sync in their thinking. I would argue that one group is significantly more honest and objective about their positions and have very much less to gain. And by that I'm referring to the ILO. And another group, and I support many of their goals, is the AFL-CIO and its national unions, who actually do have something to gain through advancing this new human rights agenda. And it can be most notably seen in the upcoming, I guess it's December 10th, Human Rights Day, which the AFL-CIO is dubbing Labor Rights Day. Let's just take a look at some of the complaints of the AFL-CIO, which emerged in 2000, the year 2000, in a report by Lance Campa of Cornell University, a legal scholar, that was funded by Human Rights Watch. And his argument is that here in the United States, many of the international norms of human rights, as well as American constitutional legal statutes, have been completely abrogated. Freedom of association. Clearly in the United States, if a worker wants to organize, that worker, and the employer opposes that worker, in most instances, the leaders of those organizations, the unionization efforts will be fired, and this process is accelerating in the last 2 years. We also look at the question of democratization abroad. The AFL-CIO does anyway, it's not me. And in that context, the United States is seen by the AFL-CIO and labor groups as promoting the violation of human rights abroad by pushing for what they refer to as democratization and free markets. They argue that, in fact, this hurts American workers because there is unfair competition on the international level. So what does the AFL-CIO want? They want the government to reform labor law, or maybe create new labor law, that would allow workers, again, to organize and bargain without interference from employers and their lawyers. On the international front, they would like to see the end of death squads and government repression of organizing efforts in the Maquiladora area, in Central America, and free trade zones around the world. The National Labor Relations Act is their primary focus, and if we see so many cases, I mean, this is true, of the violations of the rights to free speech, where nurses in South Florida and healthcare workers, home healthcare workers, are summarily fired just for wearing a union button, where more recently the Supreme Court in March of 2002, a year and a half ago, decided that if you are an undocumented immigrant and you are engaged in an organizing drive and you are fired for those activities, you will, in fact, not be eligible to recoup the lost wages. there are a number of goals that the AFL-CIO supports, and they all lead to the direction of making organizing easier, to rebuilding labor power, organized labor power as a means to rebuilding worker power. And there are organizations that have faltered and declined over the last 3 or 4 decades. Okay, so let's look at the ILO. The ILO obviously has been around for a very long time, and it has engaged in a number of international conventions, declarations, and clauses, etc., to promote the right to organize, to promote the right to strike, and to expand the human rights of workers, not just throughout the globe, in the United States as well. So one of the most important of these is the 1998 ILO Declaration of Fundamental Principles of Rights at Work. These principles include, as I pointed out earlier, the right to organize. And if we apply it to the United States, this is particularly important because it's been documented by Freeman and Rogers in their book, What Workers Want, that 42 million workers would want to be in unions if they could, but because of employer opposition, and we're talking about 90% employer opposition in the private sector, they cannot. So unions want neutrality agreements, they want the end of police and government repression and government interference. Other writers, such as James Gross, have argued that once again, the NLRA and NLRB don't work, and it also violates these conventions. So we need sweeping changes in the United States to conform to ILO provisions. Now, one thing that should be put forward is that the United States as a whole has not, in fact, been party to most of the conventions of the ILO. For instance, they have only accepted 3 or 4 of well over 100 conventions protecting the rights of workers. One of those conventions that was passed in 1930 was the abolition of forced labor. In the year 2001 and 2002, at the at the Geneva Convention of the ILO in June of 2002, the United States was one of several dozen countries that was determined to be in gross violation of the convention that argues that forced labor should be eradicated. What is unusual about it, starkly unusual, is that in fact this is one of the few conventions that the United States has signed. I mean, another one that they signed in the Clinton administration was one on child labor, which once again the student movements in the United States have had a great deal to do with it, as well as labor, not just organized labor, but the labor movement as a whole. So the United States is an offending government. And once again, the areas of forced labor in particular relate to the right to strike. And in fact, why is the United States charged with these violations in particular is because state governments are engaged in the imprisonment, the detention of workers who are striking for increased wages, workers who are not imperative to the everyday lives of people. And many of them are punished for striking. They're sent to jail. In the year 2000, the year 2001, 2002, there are 166,000. I'm going to deal with North Carolina very briefly. 166,000 convictions, 73,000 people who were punished, and of that, 10,650 people who went on strike for organizing against federal state agencies were forced to work in return, and they were sentenced to fairly long jail sentences. So the United States government has rejected this under the new Bush administration, Department of Labor. And one astonishing point is that, you know, if you call the AFL-CIO, and I'm supportive of this organization, more or less, you find that there is very little recognition of this fact, even though they allude to questions of rights of association. They do not, in fact, focus on this very serious problem. One that, by the way, here in the state of New Jersey, we recognized just several months after 9/11 with the imprisonment of striking teachers as well as striking secretaries in Middlesex County. And indeed, these workers, many of them, or some of them, were forced to work in the mess halls and in the laundries. And by the way, I've gone to mess halls and laundries over the last several years, not as a prisoner, but as a just evaluating what it looks like. These are very harsh forms of labor, very dangerous forms of labor, and certainly unpaid forms of labor. And it's astonishing that this is in fact taking place in the United States in the public sector. We're not talking about private sector employees. I'm going to finish in just a second. So actually, in just maybe 30 seconds. So what the United States must do, it's not going to do in this administration, is to bring to the attention to the ILO not just these violations, but what is probably many other violations across state governments. Compliance is something that we see in the near future, I see in the near future, as something that is not going to be forthcoming, and worker exploitation will continue. And once again, I would argue that this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, one can just go back to the 19th century, and this is why I would argue the 40s to the 70s are the exception, and see the examples of the fact that workers who formed organizations were considered engaged in conspiratorial activities and in fact jailed. So thank you very much for the opportunity, George, and I hope I finished in time.
Indeed, you did. Thank you.